He's got 4 degrees from Harvard. I don't know how many books he's written. He's a wonderful patriot, and the extra time that I would give introducing to him, I think, would be better spent speaking to you. Without further ado, Dr. Edwin Vieira.
Thank you, Tommy. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm rather humbled to be in this presence, not only in the presence of you, but of course in the presence of the spirits of the patriots who are with us today, one can be assured. Okay. Thank you. That's much better. Okay. We gather here today not just to celebrate in rhetoric a remarkable event from America's past. The original Boston Tea Party on the 16th of December, 1773, was not simply a colorful episode that transpired more than 2 centuries ago under circumstances that are no longer relevant to modern Americans' lives and liberties. To the contrary, its history provides a lesson we must relearn in our own time and lays a path from oppression to freedom that we must follow in the near future for our country's salvation. Through the Boston Tea Party, colonial Americans emphasized in deeds certain truths of political philosophy and political science that retain perennial significance and applicability. Fundamentally, the Boston Tea Party was about the 2 greatest powers of government, in particular the power of the purse and the power of the sword, and who should control, exercise, and benefit from those powers. It demonstrated that the power of the purse can be controlled only by the power of the sword, and that the power of the sword must always remain in we the people's hands and theirs alone. In the colonies, separation of the power of the purse manifested itself in the form of taxation, a form that Parliament employed and which the colonists condemned as taxation without representation. Now, the key term here is not taxation, it is without representation. Taxation without representation allows for, facilitates, and encourages redistribution of wealth from those individuals who are not represented to those who are, thus serving special interests and factions rather than the people as a whole. Moreover, taxation without representation exists not only when some individuals are openly disenfranchised. In contemporary America especially, it typically involves false representatives who disregard, neglect, and even knowingly and intentionally betray their constituents' interests. The Stamp Act in 1765 and the Townshend Act in 1767 embodied taxation without representation, pure and simple. Parliament enacted those statutes for the purpose of raising revenue through exactions imposed on the colonists, but without political participation on their part. The Tea Act of 1773 went further by using taxation without representation to create a profitable monopoly for the East India Company. The East India Company was an imperial establishment designed to extend throughout the world the power of the British oligarchy of high finance. Today it would be recognized as an agent of economic globalization, worked in aid of political globalization. By the Tea Act, Parliament licensed the East India Company to import tea into the colonies free of British customs and duties, which enabled the company to dump its product in America at prices that undercut colonial merchants, thus increasing the company's profits to the special benefits of its stockholders, which included King George III himself. This was taxation without representation that ironically lowered taxes for a few favored friends of the British financial oligarchy, thereby enabling them to loot the far greater number of Americans who were politically unrepresented but economically subject to the company's monopoly. Well, of course, the colonists considered it intolerable for Parliament to subsidize a politically influential transnational corporation at the expense but without the consent of American merchants and consumers. They were too astute to be deceived by the convoluted form that redistribution of wealth assumed. They knew that their property was being filched from them indirectly by means of the company's monopoly, as surely as their pockets would have been picked by tax gatherers directly. Soon, and rightly, colonial Americans' indignation rose to white heat. "Are we to be given up to the disposal of the East India Company?" asked an anonymous editorialist in a newsletter aptly entitled "The Alarm." "Their conduct in Asia has proven," this writer warned, "how little they regard the laws of nations, the rights, liberties, or lives of men. They have levied war, excited rebellions, dethroned lawful princes, and sacrificed millions for the sake of gain. The revenues of mighty kingdoms have centered in their coffers. And these not being sufficient to glut their avarice, they have, by the most unparalleled barbarities, extortions, and monopolies, stripped the miserable inhabitants of their property and reduced whole provinces to indigence and ruin." Well, finally, public disgust fathered, as it always must, direct action. Over protests from patriots, Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson had taken a hard line and ordered the East India Company's tea to be unloaded at Boston from 3 of the company's ships. When the final word of this official intransigence reached a mass assembly at Old South Meeting House, Samuel Adams announced that this meeting can do nothing more to save the country. And that was the signal for patriots disguised as Mohawk and Narragansett Indians to take into their own hands the power of the sword, to march to Griffin's Wharf and forcibly remove the tea from the ship's hold and cast it into Boston Harbor. Adams was prescient. After the Tea Party, mere meetings among patriots could do nothing more to save the country, for Parliament enacted the Coercive Acts. With closure of the port of Boston and the appointment of General Thomas Gage as military governor, the British version of Homeland Security based on martial law descended upon Massachusetts with a vengeance. In short order, though, the steps that Gage then took to disarm the colonists led to Lexington and Concord. Thus, the 16th of December, 1773 is one of the 3 greatest dates in the history of America's struggle for independence and liberty, along with the 9th of June, 1772, the burning of the British revenue schooner Gaspee at Namquit Point off Narragansett Bay, and 19 April 1775, the shot heard round the world. And what do all of them have in common? Each proved that ultimately the only way to gain and hold the power of the purse is with the power of the sword. The preservation of one's property as well as his life and liberty requires not only eternal vigilance, but the willingness and the ability to take immediate defensive action when dialogue and deterrence fail to fend off aspiring usurpers and tyrants. Today, Americans find themselves confronted by a problem analogous to, but far worse than the one that vexed our colonial ancestors. America suffers from pervasive taxation without representation that operates through a monopoly more far-reaching, dangerous, destructive, and vicious than the East India Company. This monopoly is called the Federal Reserve System. It includes not only the actual banking cartel, but also all of the parasitic, non-American, un-American, and even anti-American institutions, enterprises, and individuals, public and private, domestic and foreign, allied with and fattening off of it at common Americans' expense. The Federal Reserve System's conversion of public and private debt into legal tender currency and bank credit is the basis of both the hidden tax of inflation and what is called by economists forced savings, through which real wealth is redistributed from society to influential private interests through the intermediation of politicians and bankers. And if it were not enough that the banking cartel's looting has assumed gargantuan proportions, the system's inherent instability has now caused not only an accelerating collapse of paper values in the fantasy world of high finance, but also an intensifying contraction in the production and distribution of real goods and services, in response to which the system and its agents and allies in the Department of the Treasury are flooding the markets with massive doses of new liquidity, as they call it, that will soon threaten not simply the United States, but even most of the rest of the world, with hyperinflation, depression, or most likely hyperinflation accompanied with or followed by depression. Then from economic collapse will arise social upheaval and political repression until at last Americans find themselves submerged in financial fascism and its necessary political concomitant, a centralized paramilitary police state. To make matters worse, Because the Federal Reserve System's inherent instability has finally rendered its currency a liability